Hello, I'm Jean-Marc Champagne. I'm with WWF based in Hong Kong, and I'm working on or leading an effort in Asia, in the Asia Pacific, on bankable nature solutions. And it's a pleasure to be here speaking at the Climate Action Conference 2022. And I very much look forward to giving the presentation on what I think is probably one of the most innovative efforts going for conservation and climate projects. So to start off with, I'm going to move to a presentation and share my screen. Okay, so bankable nature solutions, and really what it's really what it is yes, it's working on bankable projects, but it's also mobilizing private sector capital for climate and conservation impact. So what does this mean? So what exactly are bankable projects and why do we need them? I'm going to play this short video, which will have, it's about 90 seconds, and you can see this here. It'll be a great introduction to the rest of the presentation.
We're facing a climate and nature crisis which undermines the fabric on which our economies are based. Each year, we fall $2.5 trillion short of financing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Philanthropy and public finance alone will never fill this gap. But the tides are turning. Private investors are now willing to put their money into sustainable bankable projects. From large-scale forest restoration, climate-smart agriculture to wastewater treatment plants, bankable projects are clever investments that generate financial returns while building more resilient ecosystems, societies and economies. The only problem is there's been no pipeline of bankable projects, even though investors are keen to get the ball rolling. Because of that, financiers continue to invest in projects that degrade our ecosystems and ability to adapt to climate change. Regrettably, communities, businesses and countries end up paying the full social and environmental costs of these investments. WWF have crafted an innovative solution to blend public and private finance to create a pipeline of scalable, bankable projects. Redirecting financial flows into more sustainable projects is critical to the health of our natural resources. Thanks to our global expertise and extensive presence on the ground, WWF is well placed to make these financing opportunities happen now.
So if you take a look at environmental risks, and recently the World Economic Forum Global Risk Perception Survey came out just in January. And they asked to identify what are the most severe risks on a global scale over the next 10 years. Well, interestingly enough, and not surprisingly, environmental concerns were the top three. And also you can see 7 and 8, but you have climate action failure, extreme weather, biodiversity loss, human environmental damage, and natural resource crises. So, and then you also have the red, which are societal issues. One is social cohesion erosion, livelihood crises, and infectious disease, which are also related to environmental issues and climate change issues. So as you can see, from these risks, environmental and climate issues dominate everyone's thinking. So we really need to pick up where things are going. And this perception is not just a perception, it's actually reality. So it's important to see this, to see where and why we need more funding and financing available for climate impact. So if you look here, closing the gap. So basically we have about 4.2 trillion US dollars needed to even come close to hitting the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we currently have is about 1.7 trillion US dollars. And so every year there's a financing gap of about 2.5 trillion US dollars. So we really are behind. If we really want to make this up, every year we got to have an additional 2.5 trillion US dollars going into conservation and climate, and as well as societal type impact. So we currently are not even close. If you look at the 1.7 in isolation, though, it looks like a decent number. But when you compare it to where it sits, when you look at 185 trillion of global private sector debt, or if you look at 90 trillion in listed equities, that's the stock markets around the world, right? So what we're talking about is 1.7 trillion, which is really nothing. It's insignificant when you compare it to the big the big markets that are around the world. So it's a good effort, but it's not even close. We need to mobilize a lot more. So what are we going to do, and what do we have to do? Well, the first thing is we got to engage the private sector. So how do we engage the private sector? Well, the first thing is we got to give them an incentive to want to be involved in conservation or in climate projects. So what is the first step we need to do? Why do we need the private sector? Why are they important? Well, the private sector, where we work in our conservation work at WWF all around the world, they're active in most of the areas that we work in. And they're dependent on those areas for their operations. And they're also linked to the risks and pressures in those particular areas. So they need the land and the resources that it provides for their businesses. And it could be at some point existential to their actual operations. So the other reason why we want to get the private sector involved is because they command vast amount of financial resources. And they're also very influential with the public sector. So for us to do what's called bankable nature solutions or bankable projects, we need the private sector. We see them as a valuable partner to help bend the curve. Without the private sector, we'll never operate at the scale we need to save nature. So interestingly enough, though, we didn't just come up with this idea ourselves at WWF. Yes, we'd like to take some credit for it, but we actually did not necessarily come up with this. It's actually the private sector has been coming to us saying, hey, look, WWF, we want to get involved in these projects. We want to invest in conservation projects. We want to invest in climate adaptation and mitigation projects, but we just don't know how to do it. And when we do see the projects that are out there, they're usually too small, they're fragmented. It's not really the place that we see as a place that we can make investments. So we need partners like WWF and others to help identify and incubate these projects. So they've been coming to us and we've been trying to answer that call. And that's where we came up with bankable nature solutions. So what are bankable projects? What are they? So let's talk about it. So bankable projects. Bankable has the same meaning as investable. So banks or investors can finance the project by providing a loan or equity investment. A bankable project is typically connected to a business, and it could be a new business or an improvement of an existing business. It needs to, though, address market dynamics, and it will face competition from other businesses, because what we're developing when we do bankable conservation or bankable projects is it's essentially, yes, it's conservation, but it's also a business. So we need to make sure we address all those areas. So what are the criteria for bankable projects? Well, number one, and it goes without saying, or else we at WWF wouldn't be involved, but it needs to have positive environmental and social impact. But that's standard for all conservation projects. But what makes it uniquely or inherently different is that point two, it has to have commercial value and generate predictable revenue streams. This is absolutely essential to taking it from being a standard grant-driven conservation project to one that is an actual business that has a sustainable recurring revenue stream. So the other part is it needs to be financed by private capital looking for profits. And lastly, and this is very important because we get a lot of projects that come to us, they look really good, they meet a lot of the criteria in terms of being positive environmental impact, and they have a bankable element to it, but they're not able to scale. So to really get the private sector involved, whether it's private investment or private corporations, to get them involved, these projects need to have the ability to scale or replicate to large sizes. So we're talking about anywhere between 50 and 100 million US dollars. So what are we talking about here and what are we doing? So what we want to do, and I like to say this very simply, it's really bankable nature solutions is taking the concept is to turn $1 of donation into 10 for nature. So where we work is in the early stage. If you see on the slide from year 0 to year 2, or it could be a little bit longer, a little bit less, but typically it's around that time. But we work in the grant funding stage. We provide through our external grantors, we provide seed funding or risk capital to basically invest into a project as a grant. And what that does is it helps you develop a project. It becomes something where you put in money for technical assistance, you put in money for feasibility studies, and then you develop a pilot, and then basically you have a project that looks and is prepared and ready to go. And at the same time, you model it out to make sure it's financially viable, because that's also important. And you assess the whole point over the 2 years to make sure it's a viable business. And then the next stage is we get it ready to scale up into the investment stage. And that's where we bring in impact investors, development banks to then invest into these projects, whether it be the initial stage 5 to 10 million, and hopefully we replicate it later when we get the commercial or private banking sector involved, which would be much higher in terms of where they put in capital. So the idea is really to de-risk the projects by getting the foundational work done and then driving and scaling them up to where we can then bring in the investment capital. So what we want to do, instead of getting taking a grant for, say, we get $10 million grant from a donor, instead of taking that money and piling it all into one project, we take basically maybe $500,000, we put it into the initial stage, and then the investors do the rest of the work. And then we can take the rest of that money, and instead of doing one project, we can do 20 projects. So that's what we look to do with our work. So what are bankable, how do you source bankable projects? What are they? Well, firstly, a bankable project, it has to be a viable business. It has to have a clear value proposition. And very importantly, it has to have an experienced project owner or project sponsor. And that's where the private sector comes in. We absolutely have to have experienced and financially sound companies that are working with us on these projects. We are the convener of all the parties. We won't be the ones operating these projects. It'll be the private sector operating these. So the other thing is we need to make sure that there's a market demand for what we're going to produce, because everything that we do, yes, it contributes to conservation impact, but also because it's a business, it has to have a product. So there has to be demand for the product that we're coming up with. So then we develop a proof of concept. We do a technical assessment, make sure it all works. Then we have, we want to base it on proven technology. We don't want any new experimental type technology. It has to be things that we've worked with in the past and we understand will work, and there is a demand for those in the marketplace. It has to have the ability to secure commercial contracts. So that's what we say, it has to have market demand. So it has to have the ability to get commercial contracts in place when you have an off-taker that takes the product that we've produced. You also have to identify all the key risks. Make sure that's all understood, and have it, you're working within a legal regulatory framework that works and suitable for the project and for the investors. And then you also have to have support from the key partners, such as the private sector partner, but also local governments, provincial governments, and national governments. You have to make sure everyone is on side to make these projects work. Then you have to have a business plan and an estimated budget and financially forecasted models. And then what you have at the end is a bankable project candidate. Now, all these, even if you go through all this and have a candidate, it still may not make it, but this is what you have to initially come up with. So how do we make an idea bankable? What do we typically do? Okay, well, here's what we do on bankables. So 2 ways to make a project more bankable, and this is very high level. Of course, it's more in depth than this, but what we want to do is we want to make a project more attractive for investors. So how do we do that? Well, we try to increase the expected return, or we try to decrease the project risk. So how we do that is basically when we come up with a project, we're looking for things that will enhance a company's product offering. So maybe looking at things that are organic or things that have a much higher return in the marketplace. So that's what we're trying to do. We want to have product that we produce that has a much bigger margin than maybe traditional. I'll speak a little bit about that in some of the case studies, but essentially we want to go from, say, a product that is just mainstream to selling something that has a much higher quality, that has a much better revenue expectation or margin expectation. Then we want to decrease project risk, and how we do that typically is what we said earlier about how we want to take the risk capital on with the grant money and use that to build up an actual project that looks like it works. So what is the incentives for the private sector? Again, this goes back to why they want to get involved. Well, there's new revenue streams potentially for them. Again, they can have price increases and hopefully cost reductions. Now, we recognize that there's risks that exist in every project. I won't go through all of these here, but it's important to know that when we do these work all over the world, and in this case, all over the region, that there's things like financial risk, which, there's capital risk, which, that says the project can't access enough funding for the next phase. There's completion risk where you didn't plan it properly, or you have budget overruns. Then you have sovereign risk. So if you're working in developing countries, there's a lot of risks that are involved there. Then of course you have operating risk, which is on the, you have demand risk. Maybe there's not as much demand for the product that you put forward and you thought would work, or you have performance risk, that the project underperformed as intended and doesn't meet certain requirements that you hoped it would. So there's ways to decrease the risk, which we try to do. We want to build on an existing concept. Again, we don't want new technologies. We want things that have been proven. We want to also work with very experienced private sector partners as they work with us on the project. And we want to make sure there's a proper regulatory framework in place. And we want to allocate the risks among all the partners that are involved in our projects to spread the risk out. And then we also want to use blended finance, which is exactly what this whole presentation of what Bankable Nature Solutions is all about. So we want to use development money or grant capital to then spur on or attract private sector capital. So questions that we have to define a value proposition on every project. What is the problem it's trying to solve? Does the project reduce costs? And what additional revenue opportunity does the project bring? So these are things that we need to have understanding in the first place before we even go forward with our project. So all these projects have to have this clear value proposition outlined. It's absolutely essential. So now the other thing to bring up is in the way we work on projects is through not just looking at individual projects one by one, but we work on what's called a landscape approach. Now, this is much more in depth and much more involving, but I'm just going to touch on it here. So what we want to do is we want to look at a particular area, which we call a landscape. So a landscape is essentially, there's different ways to look at it, but we're going to focus on the landscape level, which will be basically how you can identify multiple projects in a particular area. So the idea behind it is that a landscape, let's define what a landscape even is. So basically it's small enough to maintain and be manageable, but it's large enough to deliver multiple functions to multiple stakeholders with different interests. So the idea is you look at a landscape, where are the ecological pressure points, who are the private sectors that are reliant upon that landscape, and how they need the resources for their businesses. And then you find out how you can work with the private sector in a particular area. So what we want to do and how we finance these, and I'll just show you a slide here and how this works. So we want to move beyond grants. So what we want to do is look at private sector funding. So individual private sector funding. So we want to basically take the origination capital, which is the grant funding, and we put it through our Bankable Nature Solutions process, and then we get private sector investment. So this is where the investor would come in once we scale up the project and get it. So this is kind of how a structure would look. So the origination capital, we invest maybe as a grant, $500,000 into a project. We get it up and ready to get to a point where then now it's been proven that it works. It's financially viable. We forecast it out. It has strong enough margins, a strong return on investment, and that investors would actually be attracted to this. Now, it's important to keep in mind that we won't do all this work and then go running around looking for investors. No, what we do is we get investors involved at a very early stage. We get them involved right in the beginning, so then we can tailor the projects to meet the investors' needs. Because the last thing we want to do is spend months and months and months or years working on a particular project, and then at the end we're done, it looked great, and then we run around looking for investors, and then we find there's no takers. We can't find any investors to invest in the project. So we want to make sure it's done at a very early stage. But the idea is to use the grant capital to de-risk the project, to build up a pilot, to show that it can be done, and then investors will come in later and invest into the project. They will be involved again in the beginning, but they won't start putting their capital in until it's still ready to receive the capital. So what we have here and how we've been doing this over the past 2.5 years or so is through what we call what's the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development. Now, the DFCD is a very unique and pioneering consortium. And what it is basically, it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands decided that they're going to put 160 million euro of capital into this consortium. And what they want to do with it is they want to use it to mobilize, again, like I said, taking $1 donation, turn it into 10 for nature. In this case, you're going to take 160 million and mobilize over 1 billion of private finance for climate impact. And that's what we want to do. So it's a very unique and pioneering consortium. There's no other like it. But what it is, it consists of, the DFCD consists of FMO, which is the Dutch Development Bank, Climate Fund Managers, which is a quasi-development and private capital, private fund, which is between FMO and also Sanlam out of South Africa. And then also WWF and SNV, which is another NGO based from out of the Netherlands. So there's 4 of us involved in this, very unique, very pioneering. So essentially what we're trying to do with this is we're using the 160 million And 30 million of that, if you see the next slide here, here's the Origination Facility, which S&V and WWF manage. It's using 30 million for incubation or project origination. So we originate with that 30 million, and then that money, and then the next stage is where FMO and climate fund managers will come in to invest in the project. So we do all the grant work, we do the foundation work to get the project up and ready, and then the FMO and climate fund managers will do the rest. Now, what is very unique about this is that they're not just funding, a project or a few projects. They're funding WWF to go around looking for and scouting for projects within our broad network that we have. So they're one of the few. I've actually this is why it's so pioneering, because most grantors, they want to just fund a particular project, but the Netherlands, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the DFCD, they said, hey, look, what we want to do is we realize there's no pipeline of projects, and we realize the biggest obstacle to doing this is no one is funding people to actually develop these projects. So what we do is we actually take our time and effort, and we go around looking for projects and how we can develop them into bankable projects. Now, it takes a lot of effort to do this, and that's what people need to fund. Because what you'll keep hearing out there, in the, you hear this all the time recently, is so-and-so's committing 100 million here, so-and-so's committing 1 billion here. Committing to what is what I ask. Committing to what? There's no projects for this to go into. They make these big grand statements. Yeah, that's nice, but no one's committing the capital to there's no project for this capital to go into. So what we need to do, and what we need funding for, is more money into going into developing these projects, because the projects don't exist. If they existed, everyone would be doing this. So what needs to be done? So we are actually discovering these projects. We're bringing them together with private sector partners, and then we're bringing them into the actual investment world. So that's what needs to happen. We need people to actually fund this. So what we are essentially is venture capitalists. We are the angel investors. If you looked at it on a private equity spectrum, we are the angel investors to get the project up and running to a point where we're getting Series A and Series B funding. That's kind of how it all works. But no one currently is investing in that early stage. And that's what's missing to get us to the next level. Now, we have the Dutch fund, which is excellent, but we need more of these. So just to show you some examples of what projects that we're working on, because someone may ask, what are you actually doing? Well, just for the sake of time, I'll look at a few, but we have about, we have about 25 projects in Asia in the pipeline. I've highlighted, there's 6 here. You can look at the first one. It's PT Indo Bamboo in Indonesia. Basically, it's a bamboo project that we're working on. The idea is to really bring is to really have a sustainable bamboo farming. And let's focus more on one, though, that is going to be much more for climate impact. So if you look at the Humankind Group, this is a project in India that we are working on with a private sector partner called the Humankind Group. And the idea is to take rice paddy straw waste and turn that into energy and convert that into basically renewable energy. So the idea and what is behind that, what the impact comes from, is the elimination of waste burning. So it massively reduces air pollution. It increases rice yields and reduce water usage. And it also has reduces on CO2 emissions. But at the same time, it increases the farmers' incomes, and a lot of these farmers are women as well. And so there's impact mitigation and adaptation also on biodiversity loss as well as the climate. So it brings in a lot of impact for this. So basically, it helps with these areas, because in India there's a lot of pollution and there's a lot of CO2 emissions, and so this can be done on a massive scale. And so we think the Humankind Group has a lot of potential by taking this rice paddy straw waste and turning it into energy. Some other projects that we're looking at: sustainable mushroom farming in Pakistan, coffee production in Vietnam, and also a project in the Philippines. And we're also looking at some here in Hong Kong on sustainable aquaculture. We're looking at projects all around the region. So this is essentially some of the work that we're doing. And happy to go into much more detail. If anyone's interested, they can always talk to me. But for the sake of time, I realize I'm actually out of time. But I'd like to, happy to go into more details on these. But these are some of the projects that we are working on. So it was a pleasure to speak to everyone, and I hope you found this type of work that we're looking looking to do in pioneering at WWF. Was a very insightful discussion or something to listen to. And if anyone needs to contact me, please reach out to our WWF-Korea colleagues, and they can put you in touch with me, and I'll be happy to look into this further with you. Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure.